something that says like,
Yep, there you
this,
go.
yeah, great. Alrighty. Yeah, so Devin, thank you for that introduction. I'm really going to be talking about the RRPC future land use map, and Act 181 and how the RRPC future land use map has kind of what the role of that map is as a result of these changes, and how those implications shape out for the state designation program and Act 250 jurisdiction. There's really two goals in tonight's training. One is to inform on Act 181, the RRPC's future land use map, the benefits that map brings to the region through the state designation program and the Act 250 jurisdiction. And then we're also kind of through this process, we're going to be reacting to the draft future land use map. This draft future land use map, after tonight's meeting, in the coming weeks to month, we're going to be going to all 27 municipalities in the region and kind of talking about that map on what are the implications for that specific municipality, and also giving an opportunity for the municipality to make possible adjustments on a case-by-case basis. We're going to go through the statute, but there are basically specific categories we can only accommodate municipal changes under certain circumstances.
Thank you.
So the first thing I kind of want to start this presentation off is that the RRPC has had a future land use map for over a half century. On the left side of the screen, you can see our first map from 1971. Are we muted still?
Nope. Ed, can you hear us?
It says Logan Solomon is muted.
Yeah, that's his personal. We have
Okay.
Ed just shook his head yes. So if folks online you're having an issue with audio, just check your team settings and make sure you have the right audio device selected. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the RRPC's had this future land use map, for over a half century. And our first map was in 1971, with our most recent map being in 2018. What you'll see is that there are various different types of categories that we've categorized areas over the half century. But in general, whether it's a terminology for a category like village or high density or medium density, there are similar areas mapped with a similar intent. They're just done through different categories, really at the discretion of this organization over the last half century. What's changing is that from here, that basically Act 181 is standardizing the future land use map across Vermont. So as opposed to kind of, over the half century, how we've had these different categories, Act 181 is requiring the Rutland Regional Planning Commission, as well as all regional planning commissions across the state of Vermont, to use specific categories outlined in a specific statute. And those categories, there are specific criteria that in order to qualify for a category, it has to meet specific criteria. For folks in the room, there are two draft maps, and you can see a pretty long list of text on the map. That is the state law. So it's not a couple bullet points, it's pages and pages. In addition to that state law, the VAPTA, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, which is a culmination of all the regional planning commissions, developed a methodology so that we're all interpreting the statute in the same way. And I'll kind of walk through some examples of how that shows up. I kind of want to start with what is the purpose of Act 181. Devin mentioned that this was, a pretty major reform, and the main goal of this, the purpose, is really to further Vermont's land use planning goal that's been around since the late 1960s. That goal is in dark blue, and it's often referred to as smart growth, and really the idea of concentrating growth in the region's villages or urban centers, and maintaining that rural character, that rural countryside. And so that goal is at the heart of Act 181, as well as trying to increase housing development to meet the housing crisis that's currently going on, the lack of housing. So the Act 181 categories are on your screen. Essentially, how the categories were mapped was we kind of went category by category in mapping each area. So we started with downtowns and village centers, And really, planned growth areas and village areas, and all these are different categories really relating to villages and downtowns. And then, these transition areas, enterprise areas, resource-based recreation areas, these are kind of other growth areas. And on the far right side of this presentation, those 4 categories relate to rural categories. So I'm going to be walking through each of these categories in the order that they were mapped. Why the mapping order matters is that there are cases where a land area could have been categorized in multiple categories. And so where that's sort of what category should it go in, it followed this order. So for example, if an area could have been a downtown center or a planned growth area could have qualified for either, it was mapped as a downtown center. Could have qualified for a village center or a village area. If it could have qualified for both, then it would have been mapped as a village center. We're starting with downtowns and village centers. On the right side of your screen are currently all the downtowns and village centers. There are 39 different centers across 26 out of the 27 municipalities in the region. These centers are the traditional mixed use and business and civic centers in the town. And these for many of these centers, they're already enrolled in the state designation program, which provides revitalization benefits to property owners and additional benefits to municipalities in that area. And so for already enrolled state designations, they're categorized in one of these 2 categories. There are also additional centers that are currently not enrolled in the state designation program, but met the definition as a traditional, mixed-use business and civic center. And what's the difference between village centers and downtowns? A village center is not required to have, a public water system or public sanitary sewer system or zoning regulations or subdivision regulations. There are no requirements relating to any of that for village centers. But for downtowns, you have to have all 4 pieces. So, you have to have a public water system, public wastewater, sanitary sewer system, zoning regulations, and subdivision regulations. I also want to call out that there are a few municipalities in the region that are working on adopting subdivision regulations that currently don't have them. I'm looking at some of the folks in Fairhaven who are working right now on adopting them. And so throughout this process, when I talk about towns that have zoning regulations or subdivision regulations, folks that are working to adopt those regulations, we assume in this mapping process that they will have adopted those regulations. And so that box is considered checked. So I mentioned that there were existing designated village centers or existing designated downtowns in the region currently. So one thing that was done was we reviewed all the current existing designations to see, based off of the new state law, would it be eligible to expand those designations? In some cases, in the instance for downtown Brandon, it was expanded. And sorry, I forgot to mention this part. On the maps, you can see a white line, and then you can see color, like a colored polygon. The white line is depicting the current designation boundary. The polygon is depicting the expanded boundary. In no case was a currently designated area removed their benefits. No one's losing any benefits. It's only gaining benefits throughout the process as it relates to the state designation program. So, for example, for downtown Brandon, there is an extension along Union Street where there's some mixed use and commercial businesses. For Middletown Springs, which has a village center, there were certain cases where you're allowed to expand the boundary to a state historic district boundary. And so Middletown Springs was an example where their boundary was expanded based off the state historic district boundary. Mendon, on the right side, is an example of a village center boundary that was expanded to another adjacent, really largely commercial but mixed use area. In addition to expanding existing designations, there are also areas that currently aren't designated but show up in this area. I also want to call out one additional piece as well before I move on to new designations. There are some towns in the region that are currently trying to get a village center designation or get a downtown designation, or so when towns are in the process, the state designation program is still open under the original framework. Towns have the opportunity to go and apply. And so we're aware of towns that are doing that, and those proposals to get in the state designation framework pre-Act 181, before all these changes happened. Any of those efforts by the municipality is going to be included in this map. But moving on to areas that currently aren't in the state designation program that are mapped, there's a list on the left side of all the new centers that, for the most part, are being categorized as village centers. One example is Danby Four Corners, which the Danby's town plan describes as the second largest center, the original settlement site in the town. And so this is kind of an example just to say that there are these centers that meet the requirements, and towns have kind of said, hey, this is a center in the town in some shape or form with historical precedent. So I just walked through downtowns and village centers, and in the current state designation program pre-Act 181, there were designated village centers and designated downtowns. Those are being merged into a center designation. Throughout this merger, if you are in the state designation program, currently, all your benefits pre-Act 181 are going to be maintained throughout the process. And so that's really just to say that, again, no one's losing any sorts of benefits. The center designation is divided into 3 steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3. The simplest way of thinking about these steps is that step 2 is very similar to the requirements and benefits of a designated village center currently. Step 3 is very similar to the requirements and benefits that are brought from a designated downtown. Step 1 is kind of an entry-level accessible designation that the requirements, it's a lower bar to get into the program, and the benefits aren't as high as a village center. And the idea of this steps is that municipalities over time could apply and move up a step. And that's the sense. I'm about to show the specifics of the benefits. I'm not sure there's too much value in kind of going through this, but I will say that when we share out the slides, this is a good slide to go and point to get a sense of what really is the difference between a step 1, step 2, step 3. But really the simplest way to think of it is step 2 is similar to village center designation currently, step 3 is similar to downtown designation, and step 1 is an entry-level designation. So I just covered the first 2, and these are these sort of mixed-use centers in these villages. The next 2 categories are planned growth areas or village areas, which are kind of surrounding the centers, and in a way you can kind of think of them as the neighborhood that surrounds the center, and that term neighborhood will actually show back up in a few slides. But does anyone have any questions about downtown centers or village centers before I start jumping into planned growth area or village area? All righty.
There will be a quiz at the end, so.
So the first area we're going to look at is a planned growth area, and there are specific criteria on whether you're going to meet planned growth area and village area as well. And so for planned growth area, you have to be served by public drinking water or public sanitary sewer systems. This includes small community systems, and really a small community system is for an example, like a fire district system. So what I'm really trying to say here is that it might be a small system or it might be a large system, but as long as it's a public drinking water and or public sanitary sewer system, one or both.
And the state defines that as a minimum of 15 connections to a single system, served all year round.
Another requirement is the municipality has adopted both zoning and subdivision regulations. And as I mentioned about the caveat of municipalities who are working to get subdivision regulations, it's assumed that they get those regulations ahead of the regional plan being adopted. The area is generally walkable. And this is an example of where all the regional planning commissions had to say, how are we all going to agree on what the term walkable is, right? It's maybe you feel it, you know it when you see it, that sort of thing. But we all wanted to come to an agreement on what exactly is walkable. So walkability basically is at least 70% of buildings are within a quarter-mile radius of a sidewalk. So most buildings are in a quarter-mile radius of sidewalks. In some examples, it's virtually all buildings, but at minimum, it has to be at least 70%. Another consideration, or criteria rather, is that there are federally mapped and state mapped areas of high flood risk. And essentially, those specific mapped areas are excluded from the planned growth area unless it's pre-existing development and areas suitable for infill development. What that basically means is that the area, those flood hazards would be excluded if it's within like a full urban neighborhood. So it's not on the outskirts of where there might be a green field on one side of the road and buildings on the other. You're fully in a village or urban context with buildings and infrastructure on all sides surrounding. The municipal plan or zoning, we also have to look at the municipal plan and zoning and see if the area is indicated for higher density development. When you look at a municipal plan, sometimes it's very explicit where like this area is intended for higher density development. And other cases, it's not as explicit. So we would also use the zoning to see what is the intended density. So in cases where we looked at the zoning and zoning allowed for 5 dwelling units per acre, that was intended to mean higher density. Why 5 dwelling units per acre? It really has to do with being a density standard that's often used in land use planning and recent laws, specifically the Home Act of 2023 and Act 181 of 2024. Act 181 is what we're talking about tonight. I don't know why I said it like that. So that was planned growth areas. Village areas, there's also criteria. What's different from planned growth areas is that while the municipality has to have a public drinking water or public sanitary sewer system, statute doesn't specify that the actual village area itself has to be served by public drinking water and public sanitary sewer system. However, what statute does stipulate is that the area must have adequate soils for septic systems. This is another example of what is adequate soils for septic systems. And so the Agency of Natural Resources essentially has a mapping layer where they map the septic suitability of all soils across the state of Vermont in, I believe, 5 or 6 classifications. Class 1 through 3 is considered adequate soils for septic systems. And so that's essentially what that is meaning, is that the municipality has to have a public drinking water or public sanitary sewer system somewhere within the municipality, but the village area itself must contain adequate soils, i.e. those class 1 through class 3 on-site septic suitability rating. Again, another requirement, the municipality has to have both adopted zoning and subdivision regulations, and the same caveat I made earlier applies. Again, with the flood hazards, the federally mapped and state mapped flood hazards, those are excluded from the village area unless it's that pre-existing development and that kind of idea I was talking about within the kind of the core of the village, or the municipality regulates both areas up to state standards. And so essentially, municipalities can choose to regulate special flood hazard areas, and they can choose to regulate river corridors. And if a municipality chooses to regulate both those areas, not just one or another, they choose to regulate both areas, and those regulations are up to specific state standards, then you're able to exclude those areas. And there are I think there's only about 6 or 7 municipalities out of 27 that met that specific exemption relating to regulating both areas up to state standards. Another consideration was looking at the municipal plan and zoning and the general area to see, are there some opportunities where new development can occur in a flood resilient manner? So the planned growth areas, the village areas, that's where this term neighborhood shows up. So planned growth areas and village areas are eligible for the neighborhood state designation. And so this is currently there's a neighborhood development area designation, and only one municipality in the region has that, which is Rutland City currently. And so this is a transition to the neighborhood designation, similar name, with similar benefits. But the amount of towns that this would qualify for is not just Rutland City. I want to say it's about, what is that? 10, I would say, yeah, it's about like maybe 10 municipalities or so. And so, yeah, and there are these specific benefits that are afforded for the neighborhood state designation under the new framework. So I just talked about 4 land use categories: the downtown center, the village center, the planned growth area, and the village area. And I talked about how the downtown center and the village center are, related to the state designated centers, and how the planned growth areas and the village areas are related to the neighborhood designation. These areas also relate to Act 250 jurisdiction. Another piece relating to Act 181 was that there are these specific location-based Act 250 exemptions, which are basically Tier 1A is one type of exemption, and Tier 1B is another type of exemption. And then there are towns that just are not eligible for the exemptions. If areas that may be eligible for the Act 250 exemption are categorized in one of these 4 categories. But you might be asking, how do I know if my municipality, this specific center, how do we know if it meets the requirements? That's what I'm about to walk through right now. Before I do that, though, I want to kind of set the stage that these exemptions that I'm going to talk about in the future are permanent exemptions relating to the regional plan. Currently, there are temporary Act 250 exemptions that will sunset in different time periods during 2027, whether it's January or July. And I really just want to call out here that these are in some ways similar areas, but in other ways, certain areas that are not eligible now might be able to be eligible. And part of that has to do with towns working to adopt actually subdivision regulations. But now I'm going to move into the permanent Act 250 exemptions that will relate to the regional plan future land use map. And actually, one thing I also want to call out is that you'll see here that all these exemptions are specifically related to housing. Now we're going to talk about what is the difference between Tier 1A and Tier 1B, and does my municipality, might be eligible, might not be eligible. One thing I also want to make clear is that municipalities have to explicitly opt in to the Act 250 exemptions. And I'll discuss, what does that actually look like? One thing I also want to mention is that Tier 1A versus Tier 1B, I am going to be focusing a little bit more on Tier 1B, just given that the requirements for Tier 1A, the bar for that is a lot higher. And the number of municipalities that might be eligible for Tier 1A, it might only be 1 or 2 municipalities. Although, as I'll kind of go through, there are some things that are a little bit to be determined that I'll mention. So starting off, what areas are eligible? For both Tier 1A and Tier 1B, it's the centers, but for Tier 1A, it would only be the center and the planned growth area that could be eligible, or part of it, part or all. You can choose if you want to have a specific part. Versus for Tier 1B, it's centers and neighborhood designation. So it's all 4 categories. What are the Act 250 exemptions? For Tier 1A, all development would be fully exempt from Act 250 in a Tier 1A development area, not just housing, all development. For Tier 1B, it would be 50 housing units or fewer on 10 acres or less of land for housing, or a mixed use development would be considered exempt. For would a municipality have to enforce existing Act 250 conditions? When I'm talking about existing Act 250 conditions, what we're really talking about is if a parcel already has an Act 250 permit. And actually, before I go any further, is anyone not familiar with Act 250? I made this mistake last night, and someone was like, I don't know what Act 250 is. And so I want to set that stage in case someone's totally lost right now.
No new people tonight.
Okay.
Maybe.
Great. So yeah, Essentially, Act 250 is,
Hold on, Neil, is that a question or you're asking to go into more detail on what Act 250 is? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. We'll
Yeah.
assume that's what he wants.
yeah, I'll just give a brief overview. Essentially, Act 250 is a state land use regulation that applies to certain developments of historically of a certain scale. And really, these state regulations, the state board looks at 10 criteria, and essentially it's all largely historically been on the scale of the development. Act 181 is changing it, so rather than really focusing on the scale of the development, it more has to do with the location of the development, and that's how these sort of exemptions are created to say, okay, this location checks off specific boxes that show that they have the capability, whether it's a combination of infrastructure and these sort of certain things that show up in the mapping layers that the state has determined makes these areas eligible for the exemptions. Seeing a question from Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
You're on mute, Jeff.
You.
Jeff, you are muted.
You're still muted, Jeff.
How
There
about
you go.
now?
Oh, you got it. Perfect.
Okay, so the question is, and I think I see it now in paragraph 2. The question is if there was a piece of property being considered that already has an Act 250 permit, even if the Act 250 permit wasn't related to housing, does this override and provide the exemption?
So annoying.
So essentially, for Tier 1A, a municipality
Just
would
watch
have
my
to enforce existing conditions. And so essentially what that would mean is that if a parcel already has an Act 250 permit, and let's say they want to expand their operations, or they want to do something where they're changing it, and they need to amend that permit, and there are existing conditions associated with the permit, the municipality has to enforce those conditions if it's a Tier 1A area. If it's a Tier 1B area, the land use review board would continue that function. They would be the one that would enforce those existing conditions. Does that answer your question, Jeff?
What if the use that's Act 250 approved is different than the housing? Let's say there's a commercial piece of property that wants to develop housing.
What you're talking about in a Tier 1B area, Jeff?
In Tier 1B.
Yeah, so if it was a completely separate project with a completely separate permit application to the town, then yes, they would go through your normal zoning or development review board process, building permit process, zoning permit process. However, if it was still connected and fell under the Act 250 permit, that is a gray area that has not been defined completely yet. And we would need to seek additional guidance from the Act 250 Commission as to where the jurisdiction starts and stops.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the next piece I want to talk about is how would you apply? You'll see for Tier 1A, I'm actually missing the link on there. It's actually there. It's just in white. That's a mistake on my part. But essentially, the municipalities for Tier 1A will be applying directly to the state land use review board. On the contrary, for Tier 1B, a municipality is actually going to be working with the regional planning commission to opt in. And essentially, the municipality will have to give us enough information to demonstrate that they check off all the boxes, and what all the boxes are, I'm actually going to get into on the next slide. But essentially, the municipality would have to submit this information to us, and then we will have all that information. And when we go and bring our plan to the land use review board to get approval, that approval process will include the approval of Tier 1B for all the region's municipalities who chose to opt in. Given that we have to have all this information ahead of time, and it has to fit within the regional plan adoption timeline, this moves into the next part of this, is when do municipalities have to decide whether they want to opt in or not opt in order to be aligned with our timeline for the regional plan adoption. it's going to be no later than July 1st of this year. And that's in part why we're going to be going to all 27 municipalities to say, hey, you might be eligible. Do you want to opt in? What are those implications for your town? And kind of helping them, set up if they want to go and opt in. For tier 1A, since it's all you're applying to the land use review board as a municipality, and that process opens up on January 1st, 2026, and you can apply anytime. Yep.
I have a question. When you say you're going to the town, are you going to the select board? Are you going to the planning commission? Who decides if the town wants to opt in?
Yep.
Depends
Let me
on
take
the
it.
town, what town.
Ultimately, the authority lies with the select board. But
Select board.
in terms of Stephanie is scheduling these meetings, and it
Yeah.
depends on the town whether they are delegating that meeting to the planning commission or combining a planning commission and select board meeting.
What town are you from?
West Haven.
Oh, okay. West Haven is my only town who I haven't heard a response from my request for a meeting.
That's so typical.
So if you maybe get a hold of your board chair or select board members. And are you on the planning commission?
Yes, I am.
So it would be a great conversation for you to have, to say if the select board would prefer to have the meeting of the planning commission for this purpose, we're absolutely able to do that.
Okay,
Okay?
Let's touch base before you leave.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, and so like I mentioned, it's up to the municipality if they want to opt in. If you choose not to opt in, those temporary Act 250 exemptions I mentioned, they're still in place till 2027. So those are in place. But then once those sunset, then development projects would be subject to standard Act 250 jurisdiction. Now I'm going to be moving into kind of
repeat that one more time?
Oh, yeah, yep. Yeah. So essentially the earlier I had showed these temporary exemptions right here on the screen. So those are still in effect. And if a municipality chooses not to opt in, then these stay in effect. But then once they sunset, then it's just Act 250 jurisdiction. It's business as usual, pre these exemptions, these temporary exemptions coming into place.
That makes sense, Brad.
And then when they sunset, what happens?
You either opt in or it's normal
Well,
Act 250
So
procedure.
we're deciding right now.
Yeah, over the next few months. Now, there's nothing saying that a town several years from now, let's say Danby, decides to adopt zoning and they would be eligible for 1B. You could still opt in down the road if you wanted to, if towns change their mind, they adopt or get rid of zoning, things may come and go. As of right now, we won't be obligated to amend our plan. That sort of function will act in parallel to our regional future land use map, because this map is going to dictate those areas regardless whether you have the local regulations needed to be eligible for those tiered exemptions.
Right, so just because your community might have under the new state designation, a center or a neighborhood, doesn't mean you're eligible for tier 1A or B.
Right.
There are additional requirements. in
Which are on
terms of being, eligible beyond that, but you first have to have received one of those designations in order to have your foot in the door. Is that the,
That's a good way to put it. Yep.
okay,
Yeah, and so what are these requirements? For tier 1A, I'm not going to walk through those requirements. But I will for tier 1B, the municipality has to request, again, you have to opt in. You have to have an approved municipal plan. And then requirements 3 through 5 actually are also requirements that are embedded within the categories. So if you're mapped as one of these categories, you check off, you have zoning and subdivision regulations. You're excluding river corridors and flood hazards with these caveats that I had talked about earlier. That there's some sort of public drinking water or sanitary sewer system or some sort of soils that can accommodate, a septic system. For number 6, you also have to demonstrate that you have adequate municipal staff or municipal officials, and that's really going to come through self-certification.
Yeah, one thing to note too on number 4, because this is even caused some internal confusion with us. So for the tier 1B area, if you do not regulate river corridors, then those areas will be stripped out of your planned growth areas, downtowns, village areas.
Yep.
If you do regulate them, then they will be part of that exemption area, just to make that clear. So more motivation than ever to potentially adopt the state model bylaws that include flood hazard areas and river corridors. Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
I've asked this question multiple times and not too far back in time. The original statute made a poor distinction between municipal water and sewer ownerships. And a lot of towns have fire districts, which the statute doesn't require, recognize as a municipal qualifying system. Has that been fixed?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
they're different.
I was
they're
going to
different.
use an example, but maybe
Oh,
you
yeah.
have.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. There's different statutes. It's different context essentially. So in this Act 181, what you're talking about is really relating to the Home Act of 2023 and really is in a zoning context. This is really in a regional plan context where we're including small community systems. Yeah.
The short answer, Jeff, is that yes, fire districts do count as public water systems under Act 181.
Thank you. First positive answer I've heard about that.
Yeah, all the RPCs did seek guidance and clarity on that and were confirmed that that is the case. And we've heard this many times that the Home Act is what's confusing the Act 181 determination. So appreciate that question.
And the hook there is going to be with the water supply division when you have to certify the water system has the capacity to service any more growth.
Right. Yeah. And so far in our region, almost all of our systems have additional capacity. Some are very low.
Just to make sure I'm clear on so just like if you're looking to get your subdivision bylaws, you're gonna treat us like it was actually in there. It's not quite done, as long as you're working on it. If we were working on river corridors before July 1, would that also be true?
Yeah, so ultimately, by the time we adopt the plan, which will be April 2026, that's the drop dead date for at least the plan adoption period. And again, like I said earlier, if towns do adopt regs after that period, there's still going to be an opportunity to join.
And so these 4 categories that are relating to the state designation program, and some of these areas may be eligible for Act 250 exemptions. These 4 categories account for 2.5% of land area and about 38.6%, not about, 38.6% of buildings.
Before he goes on, I do want to mention, you'll probably notice this map, those pink areas look very, very similar to our 1971 and 2018 areas of development because it is the same historic development, dense development that we've had for decades and decades in the region. So, when we look at this map, yes, it is changing in context, changing in color, changing in regulatory authority, but you'll notice that a lot of the areas are the same and they're kind of what you would expect to see knowing the region, right? But one note I do want to make is that, when we have our meetings with the towns, those are the areas that we definitely want to hear from you about, like, well, there may be caveats or additions or subtractions. But know that going into this, we understand that Rutland region needs to prioritize development as much as possible, especially in those areas that can support development. So when we mapped these areas, we tried to stretch them as far as we possibly could while still passing that straight face test and following the methodology. Because ultimately with this plan, we're balancing growth and conservation, right? But for these areas that are considered our growth areas, we're trying to make them as big as possible. And that's why when Logan went through those early examples of downtowns, he saw that we stretched them beyond their original designated boundaries. We're trying to do that to support as far as we can go. There are limits to that though, and that's where the conversations with our town meetings, we'll need to understand that there will be limits to that, or else our map won't be approved and we won't get any benefits. So it will be a balance. I just wanted to make that
And
disclaimer.
one other thing too, that's worth noting is that we really also tried to, as I mentioned, part of this process is looking at municipal plans and looking at zoning. So we also, not really trying to draw boundaries, but rather use existing boundaries at the local level, whether they're municipal plan, future land use map boundaries, or zoning district boundaries. So I just want to give one example of that, which I think is really easy, is if you look in the top left corner, you'll see almost a perfect pink square. And there's a village center there, and that's an example in Benson where that's actually just their village zoning district. And so those two categories combined is just their village zoning district. And so often what we're doing is trying to take and just align with these local maps. However, you know, there are certain cases just given statute that we have to make certain changes. So if we actually zoomed in, there's maybe about 0.1 or 0.5% of Benson's zoning district that we had to exclude because there was a river corridor running through it. So that's one of those mapped flood hazards. So we tried the best we could to really include these boundaries, but it is to say that statute sometimes limited us in certain retrospects. So, oh yeah.
You know, my question is gonna be the river corridor.
Yeah.
Can you move and add the downtown designations away from that and still
Yeah, so
be cool?
the downtown.
The question, right?
Yeah, so the downtown center and so it's a different answer for different categories. For downtown centers and village centers, mapped flood areas doesn't show up in statute. We're really looking at whether you can expand to already existing mixed use in commercial areas, really, you know, expanding the core. For planned growth areas and village areas, which are really, you know, in some cases, there's more potential for new development versus the centers is already kind of these really historical, in a lot of cases, very built out areas. And so in those planned growth areas and village areas, yeah, flood hazards, those mapped flood areas, with the caveats I gave earlier, those still fly.
So if a community has flood hazard area regulations, but not river corridor regulations, would just the river corridor be pulled out of the map, or the entire area because the community doesn't have both?
Yeah, it has to be both. Yeah. It has to be both. So these four categories, right, they relate to the state designation program, and they relate to areas that may be eligible. The rest of the categories for Act 250, yeah, thank you. For Act 250 exemptions. The rest of the areas do not relate to the state designation program and are not eligible for Tier 1 Act 250 exemptions. And so I just want to make that distinction pretty clear that we're now at like a turning point where we're going to look at the categories that do not relate to the state designation program and Act 250 exemptions. So I'm starting, sorry, with I'm going to keep on going with how they're being mapped. So the next category that was mapped would be transition areas. And so the transition areas or transition infill areas is another name for them, are areas that are served by public water and or sanitary sewer system, And for one reason or another, they didn't qualify for village area or planned growth area. And really the intent of this category is to increase density through infill development. And depending on the context, you might be able to add some side streets. And also what was considered was trying to avoid areas that have flood risk. Some of these areas are kind of in a linear strip development pattern currently. Statute explicitly says that new linear strip development is not allowed. There's only a couple of these areas in the region, and actually in some regions they deemed that there was none. So our region, we have a couple of towns with them. With Rutland Town having most of those areas, I would say, being on Route 7 and Route 4, north, south, east, and west. Mendon on Route 4, there's a section of Route 4 that they have as their commercial district that's also in part served by sewer. In Pittsburgh, there's Plains Road, which is also served by, I believe, sewer and water, right? Yeah. And in Brandon, at the intersection around Forestdale Road and Town Farm Road, there's also a transition infill area. Next, we're moving to enterprise areas, which are in purple. These are, the industrial parks or natural resource extraction areas or commercial uses that involve, just a larger amount of land. A challenge, I would say, in mapping these areas is that statute explicitly says that they can't be adjacent to planned growth areas. In our region, there are another of these sort of industrial areas that are pretty close to adjacent to planned growth areas. And so we have to make sure that they weren't explicitly adjacent, but in some cases they are nearby. And also another criteria relating to this is that there must be ready access to necessary infrastructure associated with the enterprise use. So for example, if there's truck traffic coming through, the roads need to be able to handle that truck traffic. Some examples to highlight is the Omnia plant in Pittsburgh, the Rutland Southern Vermont Regional Airport, and the nearby industrial park in Clarendon. Quarry lands in the Slate Valley along the western side of the region, and also the Vermont Danby Marble Quarry on the southern part of the region. Resource-based recreation areas are large-scale resource-based recreation facilities. What they specifically not is they are not all recreation areas. I think the name is a little bit of a misnomer in that sense. So I just want to make it clear that we're not talking about every last recreation area in the region. We're really talking about these large-scale areas that, and this is the second piece, that have a higher density of buildings and infrastructure related to the resource-based recreation asset. So for example, a developed shoreline or condos near a ski resort. That's the sort of type of large-scale resource-based recreation facility with associated infrastructure. And actually, those two examples I just gave are most of the resource-based recreation areas. So there's the two ski resorts that are in Killington. Okemo Mountain Ski Resort just stretches into Mount Holly, so the portion of that ski resort that is in Mount Holly is included. For Lake Bomoseen, Lake St. Catherine, Lake Hortonia, Beebe Pond, Chipman Lake or Timid Pond, the entire pond has shoreline development, or lake has shoreline development. And so the entire lake is mapped as a resource-based recreation area. For Sunset Lake and Perch Pond in Benson, and Nineveh Lake and Mount Holly, you did. Yeah, I've been thinking I don't know how to say Nineveh Lake, but apparently I always say it right. But essentially, these two water bodies, only the developed area is mapped as a resource-based recreation area. There are other parts of the water body that are just largely conserved. There's no shoreline development, so they're not part of the resource-based recreation area. I also want to call out the Mountaintop Inn in Chittenden also has a recreation area where there's development surrounding it. And for some reason, I actually missed one in Benson. Benson Landing also is a resource-based recreation area that for some reason I didn't list. And so in aggregate, the 4 categories we talked about earlier, plus these 3 categories are designated for a relatively higher density or intensity growth. essentially this is 6% of land area and 47% of buildings. The white area, and so all of this is kind of generalized. You can kind of generalize and call it growth areas, kind of designated for a relatively higher density growth. On the flip side, there are rural areas, which is 94% of the region's land and about 42% of buildings. These are, designated for relatively lower density growth or conservation. And there's also a sort of mapping order. So if you're not a growth area, you're not one of these areas, you're somewhere in the white, they're essentially a hierarchy for what category you should be put in. So we'll look at rural ag and forestry, then rural conservation, then rural general. Hamlets, all those are dots on a map, and they're just acknowledging historic clusters. And I'll show exactly all the hamlets in the region, but all they're really doing is acknowledging these historic clusters that in many cases were mixed use and in some ways kind of were a center in the town, but today are kind of largely just a residential neighborhood. So we're kind of acknowledging that history. Starting with ag and forestry, if you are not in a growth area, right? So not one of these areas, but you are enrolled in the current use tax program, you are categorized as rural. The land was categorized as rural agriculture and forestry. For folks who aren't familiar with the current use tax program, this program requires that there's active use for agriculture, forestry, or conservation. And for most part, it's the first two. And so this is really kind of a way to see, hey, there's actual agriculture and forestry because you have to demonstrate this in order to enroll in the current use program. So if you're not in the current use program and you're not one of these growth areas, then if you're mapped as one of these conservation planning mapping layers, then you would be categorized as rural conservation. I also want to, right now I'm speaking to how were these rural areas mapped, but afterwards I'm going to speak to what is the intent of these areas. And so I'm first just talking about kind of how they were mapped. The Vermont Protected Lands Database is one mapping consideration. And so this database contains all lands designated for conservation purposes. So everything from Green Mountain National Forest down to a parcel that a landowner's decided to put in a conservation easement. So anywhere in between. Elevations of 2,500 feet or higher were also classified as rural conservation if they weren't in the current use program or one of the growth areas. The Vermont Agency of Natural Resources also maps highest priority interior forests and highest priority wildlife corridors. These are these big blocks of forest and critical areas that wildlife use to travel far distances. The Vermont Agency of Natural Resources also mapped wetlands. And so class 1 wetlands are included in this layer, and class 2 wetlands were included if they were 5 acres or greater. If you're less than 5 acres, then that wasn't a consideration. But essentially 5 acres was a barometer to say it's a regional scale to be included as conservation. And that was one of these sort of, at what point should it become significant, essentially. And so that's 5 acres was kind of decided by the regional planning commissions, or the Vermont Agency of Natural, VAPTA, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. This job is full of acronyms. Next, another mapping layer that was considered, the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources also maps groundwater source protection areas. And as well, these flood layers I had mentioned earlier, the state mapped river corridors and the federally mapped special flood hazard areas, those are mapped as rural conservation if the municipality is not regulating them. If the municipality is regulating both special flood hazard areas and river corridors both, then it was not included as rural conservation because essentially there's local adequate regulation as it relates to those.
Let me back up a second.
Yeah.
Could you explain how the current use properties currently in the current use program, are they going to be regulated differently?
Nope. Yeah,
so if someone wants to take their property or part of their property currently in current use out of the program,
yep.
the fine or fee structure is gonna remain the same, and
Yep.
it's still possible to do that.
Yep.
Thank you.
And that's, so the next category, rural general, is actually probably the easiest one to understand. It's the remaining land that, hasn't been mapped yet. And so I also mentioned hamlets. And these are the historic clusters that weren't mapped. And, like an example I can give is in Chippenhook on the eastern side of, or on the western side, sorry, of Clarendon. That is an area that at one point had a handful of stores, but now is just a rural residential part of Clarendon. I'm now going to move into rural development as it relates to these categories. And I want to bucket this based off of what does state law say specifically about rural development for these specific categories? And then what is the regional plan, the draft regional plan proposing to say? So what state law says, what you'll first see is that development isn't explicitly mentioned for rural conservation. It's not explicit, they're silent on that. What the state does say is for rural general, now I'm going to quote it, you can allow for low density residential and some limited commercial development that is compatible with productive lands and natural areas. State law says for rural ag and forestry that development in these areas should be carefully managed to promote the working landscape and rural economy and address regional goals while protecting the agricultural and forest resource value. So essentially what they're saying for these two categories is they're explicitly saying development's allowed with some caveats. The draft plan is saying that really rural general is the strongest support for rural low density development. And a kind of an indicator to kind of show that is that the rural general area has relatively good soils that can accommodate a septic system compared to the wider region, which is why in part it's given the strongest support for rural low density development. I'll also point out that 16% of this is class 1 soils, which are considered the most, like the best of the best for a septic system. And if I recall correctly, for the region writ large, it's only like, I think 9 or 10% that are mapped in this category. For ag and forestry and rural conservation, the plan is saying that context sensitive development is allowed. They're saying development is allowed in all three categories. It's really just got to consider these site specific constraints, needs to, fit a rural character in the traditional development pattern in the region. And those specific things really relate back to the state's land use planning goal I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. That's been around since the late 1960s. I also want to kind of just mention that, these areas are more likely to run into some challenges in being able to develop. In some cases, it's going to be very, very difficult to develop it, if at all. And that's just based off of current reality. So for example, in terms of like a regulatory factor, I had mentioned that 5+ acre blocks of wetlands are mapped as rural conservation. The state has statewide regulations pertaining to wetland development. For a financial factor, as actually you mentioned really well, is if you want to get pulled out of the current use program, there's a financial penalty associated with being pulled out of that program, and so that's a financial factor that makes development more challenging. As a technical factor, these areas are less likely to have adequate soils for septic suitability for a septic system. And so that's a technical factor where there might be regulations are good, finances is good, but when it actually comes down to the nuts and bolts of putting in a septic system, the soils just cannot accommodate that. And so I kind of just want to reiterate that we're not really trying to, we're trying to allow rural development provided that it's compatible with the rural character and traditional development pattern of the region.
Yeah, one thing I want to add to that, Logan had sort of mentioned that in the rural general categories, generally that's where the adequate soils for in-ground septic systems are. Right now, mapped, it's about 17% of the region's land cover, but 40% of the buildings within this category. So it's to say that people have already built in this area and will continue to build in this area because it's buildable, right?
Yeah.
Those rural ag, rural forestry, rural conservation, that's 35% of land for rural ag and forestry, but only 6% of buildings. And rural conservation is 42% of the land, but only 5% of the buildings. So you can see, it's more the building constraints that are limiting development in those areas than anything else.
Yeah.
And look around, that's no surprise, right? We live in a mountainous rural region. It's sort of like what I said earlier, where some of these areas are a bit intuitive because they're areas that we've developed historically. And I think the point of rural development is that, largely it'll be status quo. And Logan's going to get into that in a minute, that, this plan isn't going to further regulate that rural development more than it already is.
It's not, Devin, or
It is not.
in the feasibility for the residential development in rural, it's septic capacity, basically.
I would say that's a key. That's a key. It's not
probably
the
number one.
sole. It's not
Yeah.
the sole consideration, but
Can you define rural, in respect to a village center? Is there a distance? I mean, everybody talks about energy and, the travel, consumption of energy for travel to the village center. Is that falling in here anywhere?
No,
Okay.
no. The only sort of travel component, like Logan had said earlier, within the village areas would be those like the quarter mile to the walkability within the village, but no sort of context with commuting patterns into village areas from rural areas. And that's an interesting point, Dan, only that we know the average commuting time in Rutland County is about 25 minutes or
Right.
so. So it's not small, right? And that is a consideration, but for this
Commuting to
mapping,
Rutland?
Huh?
Commuting to Rutland, or
the average commuting time for anyone who lives in the region is about 25 minutes
commuting to where?
to work. Yeah. They're commuting patterns generally.
Okay.
So
Logan, can I?
Yeah.
This may be in the weeds too much, but, you've got 5% wetlands on a parcel. Is that contiguous, or
Yeah.
does it have to be, or can somebody come up and say, we've got 2% here?
no, we're talking about a contiguous one wetland block. Yeah, not, hey, I have a parcel and I have wetlands scattered around and we
Yeah,
add them all up.
right.
No, we're not doing any of that. Yeah.
yeah, and definitely no, this came up last night as well. It's a great question, Bob, that this plan, just like septic systems and wetlands, is not going to replace the need to do test pits or wetland delineation. We couldn't possibly, that would take 100 years to map the region that way. It's really a generalized view using all the data sets that are available and laid out in the methodology that are going to get us that general area. It won't replace the needs for permits under A&R,
Yep. And so when you put all the pieces together, this is the map. And now I'm going to kind of talk about what Devin was talking about, or started to talk about, which is kind of looking at land area versus buildings. And what we'll see here is that, the rural areas have most of the land, and, rural general has 40% of the buildings. And that's kind of indicative of what Devin was saying, was that these are the areas that have, rural development already, because there's good soils that can accommodate a septic system. But also, even though the planned growth area is only 1% of the region's land area, it accommodates for 27 or 28% of the region's buildings. And so that's a great example of really showing that our villages really contain a high density. And you can really see that whether it's the planned growth area or the village area, or their downtown or village center, all of these areas have relatively a small slice of the land area pie, but a relatively big slice of the building pie, is one way to put it. Now I'm going to talk about what this map does not do, and I kind of wanted to make it clear with a big X. And so I mentioned, that Act 250 historically has been based off the scale of the development, and that Act 181 is moving it to the more of a location-based jurisdiction. Tier 1 and Tier 1A and Tier 1B are the areas that are exempt. And then tier 2 and tier 3 are not exempt. Tier 2 is mostly status quo with a quote unquote road rule, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Tier 3 is enhanced jurisdiction. I'm going to get into it in a second, but a lot of tier 3 is TBD. What I want to say though is that there's a big X, and the reason is like we are not involved in the tier 2 or tier 3 rulemaking. There have been some myths, early on when this was just an idea, Act 181 before it was passed, of maybe these maps will have. That's not the case at all. We are not trying to get involved in this. We're not involved in it. So for tier 2 areas, like I said, it's the same jurisdiction in terms of acreage, units, or lots. But there's this road rule, and what the road rule is specifically is if you're constructing a single road that exceeds 800 feet in length, or if you have a development project where you're maybe putting in multiple roads or multiple driveways, if it exceeds 2,000 feet, Act 250 jurisdiction is expanded under those cases in tier 2 areas. In tier 3 areas, these contain critical natural resources that merit consideration. The Vermont Land Use Review Board is undergoing a rulemaking process that's starting around now into May 2025. And they're going to be, we don't know what that rulemaking process is going to look like at all. And then in terms of we don't know what the areas are, we don't know what the enhanced jurisdiction is. We don't know. And the Vermont Land Use Review Board is required to deliver a final rule for tier 3 areas by February 1st, 2026. So we'll know by February 1st, 2026, what does tier 3 actually mean? What is the rules associated with it? And then at the beginning of 2027, then Act 250 jurisdiction, tier 3 will actually go into effect. So the next steps, we are, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, we are going to all 27 municipalities to talk about updating the regional future land use map with really a focus on what it will mean for that specific municipality. If the municipality is eligible for tier 1B, we'll kind of talk about, walking through that sort of those trade-offs and how you would actually apply. And so that's the end of the presentation. I really appreciate everyone taking their time to come out and discuss this. I know this is a pretty dense topic. And so I really appreciate everyone coming out on a night like tonight to talk about this.
Yeah.
We use the word density many times.
Mm-hmm.
Who establishes density? Is it going to be the local zoning ordinances, or is it the 181 plan? For rural development.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and proper.
We're speaking the most general terms.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no definition outside of when he had mentioned density within planned.
Yeah, planned growth
areas.
areas, there was 5 dwelling units per acre. Because for planned growth areas, the town has to have zoning. And that's one of the requirements for planned growth areas. And so we looked at the zoning to see if they had that 5 dwelling unit per acre. But otherwise, we're speaking in the broadest of terms. Yeah.
So, and back to that tier 2, tier 3 thing, we're gonna try to communicate as soon as available to you all as to what that means and how it will impact you all. Again, it will not be reflected on this map, which we are happy about. The hope is that the tier 3 areas will not surpass in volume the tier 1 areas, but we don't decide that. I would expect that the vast majority of the region would fall under tier 2, as it does now. So those rural areas, like Logan had pointed out, are a significant amount of the land cover, and those will sort of just be status quo other than that road rule. That is sort of the caveat.
Rules establishing that?
The Land Use Review Board, which is the new version of the Act 250 Commission, which is now a paid staff. And they did come down to the Rutland region a couple months ago and presented and had a meeting here. And they'll be back again, I think, in July to have a meeting here. So a lot of things still in play. We're very much looking forward to having these one-on-one meetings with each of your towns to dial in the map and get it right, make sure that you all feel good about it, we feel good about it, and it meets the methodology, like I said, so that when we go to adopt the plan in April 26th, it's a sure thing. Because one, if we don't, our plan will expire and that will be bad news for the entire region, right? Because we'll no longer have party status to Act 250 proceedings and everyone will lose their benefits. So the goal is to make sure, like it has been all along with this regional plan update, that we're including as many voices as we can throughout the process, that when we get to adoption, everyone knows what's happening and they feel good about it. So as part of the town meetings, we're also going to be kicking off our third phase of public engagement for the general plan. And we'll get into this in all those public meetings, but this will be the big final push to get all of your input on the draft plan, because our goal, out of necessity and out of scheduling, is to have our regional planning commission board tentatively approve the plan in September, because from September to April, that's how long it takes to go through the adoption process. You know, it's 6 months of work to get this plan adopted through all the hearings. So we're looking for those conversations. And again, thank you so much, folks online and folks in the room, for coming. Really appreciate it.
Just a quick question. The schedule of meetings, is it gonna be on your website, or do we have to check in with each municipality to find out?
What town are you in?
I would be interested in Rutland City and Rutland Town and Center Rutland.
Rutland Towns has been scheduled.
Okay,
They've already provided public notice for the special meeting.
okay,
Rutland Cities
The 28th,
is
it's tentative.
is tentative because
They meet Monday.
the board meets Monday, and we've requested that the board refer the matter to the Community and Economic Development Committee
yeah.
for a meeting on the 28th. So we won't know until after the Board of Aldermen meeting on the 21st what they ultimately decide.
so,
So you'd have to monitor Rutland City, or you
Okay.
could circle back with me.
okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
But that's an idea. I mean, we'll talk internally about if we can throw those on our landing page if they are scheduled, our regional plan landing page. Yeah, Dan.
You just touched on, want to understand, is Act 250 doing away with the 10
Just 10
district,
acre town, 1 acre towns? Is that what you're
no,
asking?
the 10 commissioners? 10 districts under Act 250?
Nope, there will still be a
What was the
Rutland.
development review board, and is that the town level then?
Yes, yep. So the Act 250 Commission in Rutland, the commissioners will still exist.
Did you want to just quickly mention the towns that we have identified as being tier 1B eligible?
We don't have that list right in front of us, but
Okay.
we could
So if you,
go through it
I
right
know-
here, I
yeah.
guess.
I recognize a lot of faces in the room that I've been in contact with to schedule the meetings. So if I've indicated in our communications that part of the reason for looking at the map is to, get your town input and also make a determination about 1B, you're a 1B town. If you've not seen any indication of that being a discussion item at the special meeting, it's because we've
Not eligible.
identified that you don't meet the eligibility criteria.
So there's about, 12? Wallingford, Pulteney, Rutland City, West Rutland, Castleton, Fairhaven, Benson, Proctor, Pittsford, Brandon, Killington. Mendon.
Ended, yes.
They're 1Bs.
There are
They would be
potential for
eligible.
one.
Because ultimately, a municipality chooses whether to opt in.
Is there anyone at 1A?
1A we're waiting a little bit on some guidance on what exactly.
Yeah, the 1A towns, any town who is eligible for 1B and meets the criteria for 1A could apply in theory, but that application actually goes to the land use review board and they make the determination. As of
The way statute's written currently, it appears to be 1A eligible. You would have to have both flood hazard regulations and river corridor bylaws.
Yep.
And right now, anybody who's 1B eligible doesn't have both of those in order to,
Castleton is the only one.
do they meet the other 1A eligibility criteria?
Technically, and Brandon, sorry, Castleton and Brandon both, yeah. Yeah. So TBD, again, you know, it's kind of like the tier 3 thing, you know, we don't know. We know for sure that Rutland City wants to apply, and will help any town meet that eligibility criteria like we are in Pittsburgh, Proctor, Fairhaven. Who else? Kind of, we're all over the place trying to get folks up to speed as quickly as they can to get these regs established, so. Okay, awesome. Lot of cheery looking faces. We'll see you all very soon. Thank
Very
you.
much for hosting us and buying our stuff tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you folks
Thank you.
online for joining. Appreciate it.
Stay out of
Maybe
trouble.
not, you're on the move too much.